A captain thought the danger had passed. That is the image I want you to begin with. Not a treaty draft, not a press conference, not a presidential post. A captain easing a commercial vessel back toward the narrow throat of the global energy system. Because Iran had just announced the Strait of Hormuz was fully open. Because the President of the United States had posted thank you to Tehran. Because oil had dropped more than 10% in a single session and fallen below $90 a barrel for the first time since this war began. Because markets had already decided the story was moving toward relief. Then, within 18 hours, the strait closed again. IRGC gunboats opened fire on Indian flag merchant vessels. A container ship was hit by an unknown projectile. Dozens of tankers that had started moving back toward the passage turned around, and the ceasefire holding this whole arrangement together is due to expire on Wednesday, 3 days from now. The easy narrative is that this was chaos, a confused regime, mixed signals, an administration that celebrated too early and got embarrassed. I think that reading is wrong. What happened in the last 24 hours was not confusion. It was a demonstration. Iran opened the strait long enough to show the world what reopening does. It showed how fast markets calm down. It showed how quickly Washington softens its language. It showed how badly the world wants to believe normality has returned. Then it closed the strait again to prove the more important point. The thing being negotiated here is not whether Hormuz is open. The thing being negotiated is who gets to decide. That is the real story. The real story is not that the strait opened and then closed again. The real story is that Iran is trying to turn the world's most important energy choke point from an internationally governed passage into a conditionally managed corridor where passage depends on Iranian approval. Once you see that, the last 24 hours stop looking erratic and start looking precise. So let me build this carefully because the sequence is everything. On the 28th of February 2026, the United States and Israel launched strikes on Iran. Among the targets was Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, who was assassinated on the first day of the war. Iran answered in the two ways that mattered most. First, with missiles and drones against American assets in aligned Gulf states. Second, by shutting the Strait of Hormuz to foreign shipping at its narrowest point. That waterway is only 34 kilometers wide. In peacetime, around 20 million barrels of oil move through it every day. Roughly 1/5 of the world's seaborne oil, around 20% of global liquefied natural gas as well. The Dallas Federal Reserve ran the numbers in March a quarter. Long disruption on that scale strips close to 1/5 of global oil supply, pushes West Texas Intermediate toward $98 a barrel, and cuts annualized global real GDP growth by 2.9 percentage points. That is not ordinary volatility, that is a structural shock. And yet, even here, most people still flatten the story. They talk about Hormuz as if it were a simple switch open or closed on or off. That is not how Iran has operated this crisis. The first thing Iran did was not impose total closure in the pure military sense. It imposed hierarchy-friendly states were treated one way, hostile states were treated another. Some countries got permission, some countries were denied. Some governments negotiated their way into temporary access. China, Russia, India, Iraq, and Pakistan were treated as friendly. Their vessels were allowed through. In some cases, they moved under Iranian military escort. Later, Malaysia, Thailand, and the Philippines also obtained passage through bilateral talks. Every government that wanted its ships to move had to go to Tehran in one form or another and ask. Some got yes. Most Western countries got no hold on to that fact because it is the center of everything. The second thing that happened is that the shock spread faster than the models suggested it would. Iraq and Kuwait began cutting output in early March, not because they had been directly struck, but because their storage was filling up and their tankers could not move. Oil that cannot leave becomes oil with nowhere to go. Once storage fills, production has to slow. That means the economic damage starts traveling outward from the strait without requiring a single additional missile. That is not ordinary military leverage, that is infrastructure leverage, silent, mechanical, self-propagating. The third thing is that Washington's effort to force the strait open on the old universal terms largely failed. On the 15th of March, Trump called on countries that depend on Hormuz to take military action to reopen it. Germany, Spain, Italy, the United Kingdom, Australia, South Korea, and Japan all declined. Germany's Defense Minister Boris Pistorius said it flatly. This is not our war. The United States then escalated with force. A 10S Apache gunships, penetrator munitions on underground coastal missile bunkers. Iranian naval assets destroyed on the 26th of March. IRGC naval commander Alireza Tangsiri, the man overseeing the Hormuz enforcement system, was killed. The strait did not return to universal neutral passage. That is the point. And now you can see why the incident with India matters so much. India had been designated friendly. Indian-flagged ships had been allowed through for weeks. India had quietly accepted that bilateral arrangement without invoking UNCLOS or demanding universal transit rights. Then yesterday, Iran opened fire on Indian flag merchant vessels, and India summoned the Iranian ambassador in protest. That is the doctrine in its rawest form. Even a friendly pass is revocable. A right is not revoked that way, a permission is. And that brings me to the framework I think explains this entire conflict more clearly than any of the usual phrases. I call it the toll booth doctrine, not because the toll is only money. Sometimes it is money, sometimes it is diplomatic silence, sometimes it is recognition, sometimes it is an understanding that never appears cleanly on paper, but the principle is the same. The booth operator decides who passes when they pass and on what terms they pass. Once that principle is accepted in practice, the argument changes completely. The question is no longer whether Iran can disrupt Hormuz. The question becomes whether the world can move through Hormuz without first acknowledging that Iran has a say. That is the more important fight, that is the more durable fight, and it explains why the ceasefire language matters more than most people realize. The Pakistan-brokered ceasefire on the 8th of April included a clause that should have been treated as a global front-page alarm and was not. According to a regional official cited by the Associated Press, Iran and Oman would be permitted to charge transit fees on ships passing through the waterway. With the fees directed toward Iranian reconstruction, stop on that for a moment. A transit fee in a ceasefire agreement between a superpower and a country it had just spent 40 days bombing. That is not a stray technicality. That is institutional language. That is the language of a system trying to outlive the war that created it. The Islamabad talks that followed ran for 21 hours. Vice President J.D. Vance led the American side. Iran's parliamentary speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf led Tehran's delegation. Washington demanded a 20-year moratorium on uranium enrichment. Iran offered 5. The White House rejected 5. Iran's foreign minister accused Washington of maximalism, shifting goalposts, and blockade. Then, on the 13th of April, the United States imposed a full naval blockade on Iranian ports. As of this morning, 21 ships had been forced to turn back. The ceasefire is close to expiring. There's no confirmed date for a second round of talks. That is what you can see on the surface. But underneath the surface, the toll booth doctrine is hardening. The usual media frame still says the strait is a weapon. Iran closes it. America tries to force it open. One side blinks, the strait reopens. Normality resumes that frame is too shallow. Iran is not fighting to close the strait forever. Iran is fighting for the permanent right to conditionally open it, not closure, conditionality. Those are different goals. And once you understand conditionality as the true objective, almost every Iranian move since the 28th of February starts to look logical instead of erratic. This is where the Suez comparison becomes useful. In 1956, Egypt's Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal. Britain and France invaded with Israel to reverse it by force. The United States forced them to stop, not because Eisenhower had some sentimental attachment to Nasser, but because Washington understood the larger problem: if great powers could settle the legal status of strategic waterways by military seizure, every canal and every strait would become a permanent war question. What happened in the end? Egypt kept the canal. Egypt still charges fees on ships that transit it. The crisis was noisy and dangerous. But the lasting result was institutional. The canal emerged with a new governing reality. The world adapted. That is why Suez matters here. Iran does not need to militarily defeat the United States in order to win the architecture of Hormuz. It only needs the world to operate for long enough under a new practical rule that the new rule becomes difficult to reverse. And look at the language already on the table: transit fees, designated routes, security supervision, safety certification, environmental protection, transit certificates. That is not the language of a temporary minefield. That is the language of a port authority drafting its future charter. Military force is being translated into administrative language because administrative language survives longer than military force. If you tell the world, we mine the water and nobody passes, that is war. If you tell the world, ships may pass under controlled conditions on designated routes with certified transit and paid services, that is the beginning of an institution. That is much more dangerous for Washington than a dramatic headline about closure. Closures create pain. Institutions create precedent. Now, let me steelman the opposing case because there is a serious argument on the other side. Iran is weaker than it looks. Its economy is under huge pressure. Its ports are blocked. Its refineries have been hit. Its leadership has been degraded. Its nuclear position remains vulnerable at the negotiating table. Its need for a deal is probably greater than its rhetoric suggests. Therefore, what looks like strategic architecture is really bargaining theater from a state under severe stress. That argument is not stupid. A lot of it is true. Iran is under pressure. The damage is real. The war has cost it dearly. The blockade is real. The enrichment gap is real. A state in that position often sounds hardest right before it yields. But the structural weakness in that argument is this. It assumes Iran has to win the war to win the framework. It does not. Iran only needs to force enough adaptation by enough states for enough time that the old universal rule weakens in practice, and that has already happened for weeks. Different countries moved under different passage arrangements. Markets priced those arrangements. Shipping firms rerouted around those arrangements. Friendly states negotiated inside those arrangements. No clean, universally enforced restoration of the old order appeared. Instead, a messy but functioning reality emerged in which access was differentiated. That is how new systems usually begin, not with elegant declarations, with ugly adaptation. That is why the last 24 hours matter so much. Iran opened the corridor and the whole world relaxed instantly. Iran closed it and the whole world recoiled instantly. That means Iran has already proved the single fact it most needed to prove. It can alter the operating conditions of the global economy faster than the world can build a military or legal answer to stop it. That is first order leverage. Now consider the legal question directly under Part 3 of the 1982 UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, Articles 37 through 44. The Strait of Hormuz is a strait used for international navigation. That means ships enjoy transit passage. No coastal state is supposed to require permission. No coastal state is supposed to charge passage fees. Transit is supposed to be continuous and universal. That was the law as written. It was also the framework largely accepted in practice for decades. It is not the framework that has existed since the 28th of February, 2026. What the ceasefire text appears to have done is dress a new wartime practice in enough legal language to let it function without anyone openly admitting what was signed. The International Maritime Organization has not issued a decisive ruling restoring universal transit rights in practice. The UN Security Council has not passed a clean resolution reasserting that no state may charge for passage. The vacuum that opened when the war began has not been filled. It is being occupied quietly. That is the danger. Now bring China into the story, not China as a headline, China as structure. More than half of China's total energy supply passes through Hormuz. Around 1/5 of its oil comes directly from Iran. Trump posted that Xi Jinping was happy because the strait was being permanently opened and because China had agreed not to supply weapons to Iran. Wang Yi said resuming normal passage was a unanimous call from the international community. Fine. Those are the words. Look at the behavior. Chinese flagged vessels have moved through the strait throughout the crisis under Iranian permission, under bilateral arrangements that almost certainly involved some combination of fees, political understanding, or quiet recognition of Iran. As framework, China did not invoke, unclose, and demand universal transit rights by force. China did not join a coalition to reopen the strait on old legal terms. China did what major powers often do when rules break. It found a practical arrangement that protected its interests and let the legal argument trail behind. That matters enormously, because if a power as dependent on Hormuz as China can live inside a permission-based system while still speaking publicly in the language of general navigation, then the toll booth doctrine gains oxygen. Beijing's commerce may end up endorsing a reality its diplomacy refuses to name. The same question now hangs over India. If India renews a bilateral arrangement with Tehran after its ships were fired upon, that tells you the doctrine is resilient even under direct strain. If India refuses, invokes universal transit, and pushes back against bilateral permission, then one of the key internal pillars of Iran's framework starts to crack. Europe is in a different position, but not a stronger one. The LSFA conference this week matters not because Macron and Starmer suddenly have a ready-made solution. It matters because Europe has finally recognized the real problem. The problem is not simply whether the strait is open this morning. The problem is what legal and political order governs the strait after the smoke clears. If Europe cannot build a framework that supersedes bilateral permission slips issued by Tehran, then European ships will eventually pass Hormuz on terms set in Tehran, not Brussels, not London, and not Geneva. Europe spent the entire war declining to join a coalition to reopen the passage by force. That was a choice. Choices have architectural consequences. So what do you watch now? Not the noise, the structure. First, watch what the IRGC says when the ceasefire approaches expiration, not what Trump posts, not how anchors phrase it. Watch the language. If the language remains administrative, designated routes, transit conditions, supervision, certificates, service fees, then the doctrine survives whether or not bombs resume. If the language snaps back to pure closure, then Tehran is stepping back from the institutional claim and reverting to a simpler wartime threat. Those are not the same outcome. Second, watch Chinese tankers, not Chinese diplomats. If Chinese vessels continue transiting under Iranian terms while Beijing publicly talks about general navigation, then China will have endorsed the toll booth doctrine in commerce while disavowing it in words. That is not hypocrisy. It is a strategic hedge. Third, watch India. S next move. Not India S anger. Anger is easy. Structure is harder if India quietly repairs the arrangement. Iran's model has survived a serious test. If India refuses and goes legal instead of bilateral, Tehran loses one of the most useful proofs that friendly powers can be kept inside the system. Fourth, watch Asim Munir, not Pakistan. As public spokesman, Munir has been the real channel in this mediation. If he moves toward Washington or Tehran in the next 72 hours, a ceasefire extension becomes much more plausible. If the process stays stuck at the foreign ministry level, the gap is larger than the press language suggests. Fifth, if American strikes resume, watch the targets. If Washington prioritizes command infrastructure connected to Hormuz enforcement, the United States will have understood that the real fight is not only against boats and mines, it is against the institutional apparatus trying to turn wartime control into a post-war administrative, right? And if the ceasefire is extended without removing the fee language from the text, that may be the clearest signal of all. It would mean the institutional cost of this new arrangement has already been accepted, even if almost nobody is willing to say so clearly in public. That brings me back to the opening question, what is Iran actually fighting for? Not Khamenei's legacy, he is dead. Not nuclear weapons in the crude cinematic sense, a state that actually detonates or openly races to a bomb becomes a pariah and a target, a state that holds its nuclear program just below the line, keeps the alarm alive and the leverage alive. Iran's nuclear file is a negotiating instrument as much as a strategic deterrent. What Iran is actually fighting for is the right to remain institutionally relevant after this war ends. And the mechanism for that relevance is 34 kilometers of water. For 30 years, the governing answer was simple. No one owns the passage. Transit is free. That answer has now been destabilized. The new answer being tested in ceasefire text, bilateral shipping arrangements, IRGC statements, and real-world market adaptation is very different. Transit may continue, but transit may continue conditionally. Conditionally means on routes set by Tehran. Conditionally means under supervision accepted by Tehran. Condition means with paperwork, coordination, fees, exceptions, and permissions that did not exist in the old universal framework. That is the fight. That is why the last 24 hours were not random. Iran opened the strait to prove what the world gains when it opens. Iran closed the strait to prove who still controls that gain. And now the world has to answer the harder question, not whether Iran can make Hormuz dangerous. Iran already proved that, not whether Iran can reopen Hormuz. Iran just proved that too. The real question is whether the world is slowly getting ready to accept a future in which the strait is open only when Iran chooses to open it, and open only on terms that Iran increasingly defines. That is the shock sitting underneath the headlines. One day, the world may realize that the legal status of the most important waterway in global energy changed during a war, not in one grand declaration, but in increments, in exceptions, in temporary fees, in bilateral passes, in ceasefire language, in market adaptation, in ships waved through and ships turned back, and almost nobody admitted it was happening while it was happening. If that moment comes, it will not feel like an ordinary geopolitical update. It will feel like discovering the map changed while everyone was staring at the smoke. For 3 decades, the argument was whether any state had the right to charge the world for moving through Hormuz. After everything that has happened, every exception, every pass, every route, every fee, every ship turned away, every ship temporarily let through. The question is different. Now, the question is no longer whether Iran can close the strait. The question is whether the world is preparing to pay politically, legally, economically, and perhaps literally to have it open.